This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. Like many of you, I'm a big fan of watching sports live and in person. When I was in Chicago, I'd bounce between the United Center for Bulls games, Wrigley to catch the Cubs, and Old Comiskey to watch the White Sox. Sports stadiums and arenas like the ones I just mentioned can cost hundreds of millions, even over $1 billion. And they stand to make teams and their owners a lot of money. And yet, many of those sports venues are paid for with taxpayer money, public subsidy for a private enterprise. It's a story on how billions of American tax dollars are being spent on buildings that sit empty most of the year and that you might not even be able to afford to enter. See, sports owners around the country have pushed for public subsidies for their teams' stadiums and arenas, arguing they provide a significant boost to the local economy. But do they really? And are they worth it in the end? We take a look at the economy around public funding of sports venues in the latest edition of our In the Loop Scoreboard series. Taxpayer funding of sports venues is common, with billions of dollars in subsidies funding the construction or renovation of dozens of facilities operated by professional sports teams. Out of the 124 teams in the 4 largest North American professional sports leagues, the vast majority play in venues either built using public funds or that were taxpayer subsidized in some way. It can lead to large amounts of money paid from local governments to teams. The National Football League's Buffalo Bills are staying in the Buffalo suburb of Orchard Park thanks to a deal reached earlier this year to build a taxpayer-subsidized stadium in the same spot where the Bills play now. Out of $1.4 billion in costs, $850 million of that will come from state and local funds.
How about keeping the Buffalo Bills for 30 years? This is going to ensure that our children's children will be able to watch the Buffalo Bills.
And the newest Major League Baseball stadium, Globe Life Field in Texas, came to be thanks to a deal giving $500 million of investments of public funds to the team, plus all the rights to admissions and parking tickets. Now, for the record here, voters tend to approve these changes, but that might have something to do with how arguments in favor of stadiums are presented. Teams' arguments for public funding often rely on the idea that it will generate money and business in a neighborhood, city, or state. If you as a taxpayer provide money for a stadium, the thought is that people locally and from outside the arena will come in, and the stadium would pay for itself by boosting the economy. It's an idea that relies on the economic principle of the multiplier, assuming that more dollars spent there will boost local incomes and lead to people spending more money locally.
Before something's built, somebody, a consultant, an analyst sits down and they say, okay, I think there'll be this many people and I think they'll spend this much money and this much will be sales tax, and we do some multiplication and some more multiplication and even some more multiplication, and we come up with some really big number of the hundreds of millions of dollars of impact that this sport property is going to have.
But there's a caveat there. All of this is being done before anything's built, before any games are played. So the math, well, it can get kind of fuzzy.
You can imagine that there's lots of assumptions that go into that. And the people that do these before the fact are hired generally by either the league or the team or the sporting body. And so they have some incentive, let's say, to maybe push the boundaries of those assumptions that they're making.
But Victor Matheson, an economics professor at the College of the Holy Cross, who specializes in studying the economic impact of sports, says there are a couple of issues with those assumptions. First of all, the business of sports is smaller than we think it is.
As it turns out, professional sports is actually a pretty small business when it comes down to just direct dollars and cents. The biggest and richest and most successful league in the entire world, the NFL, generates revenues approximately the same as Sherwin-Williams paint stores.
And if you pulled a sports team out of a city entirely, where do those revenues go? Turns out, not all that far.
They're generating $400 million of revenue every year, but that team disappears. What happens to the local economy? Does it fall by $400 million? Actually, it falls significantly less than that, because people will figure out some other way to spend their entertainment dollars in the absence of an NFL team.
And stadium subsidy opponents warn that cycle teams promote ends up looking slightly different than advertised, with taxpayer money just going into owners' pockets when it could have been used to fund local projects. So which side has it right here? The numbers seem to show most of stadium funding is a subsidy that heads straight to wealthy owners. Sports economist Michael Leeds at Temple University studied the effects, doing a study looking specifically at Chicago sports teams. He found that a sports team doesn't have the impact on a city that you'd think.
A baseball stadium has been compared to a mid-sized department store. And that is probably the ceiling, because obviously a baseball stadium attracts people 81 days a year, roughly. A football stadium, which attracts people 8-9 times a year, far less. So it's really quite small.
All those cities are getting about the same return from, say, a Macy's as a stadium. Why does it look like there's so much more gain? Or like whole neighborhoods have been turned around by stadium construction?
If you look at examples of fans who go to a new ballpark and they see all this development around them, they're seeing the addition, they're seeing the gain. It's very conspicuous. What they don't see is the loss. So on the other side of town, maybe a whole bunch of businesses have gone out of business because more people are spending their beer money closer to the ballpark than further away.
So what advantages do team owners have? Well, for one, they own the team. Majorities of Americans consider themselves sports fans, and wherever you are in the country, you probably don't have to look very far to find people who are incredibly dedicated to their teams. And the owners have money. Wealthy owners and developers have the power to donate to pro-stadium officials, as we saw before the building of the Los Angeles Rams' privately funded home of SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California. And although there was a lull in public funding requests in the aftermath of the 2008 recession, teams have been back asking for public funds a lot lately. The Washington Commanders are hoping to get $350 million in funding from Virginia to build a new football stadium there. Maryland, where their current stadium is, offered money to develop the area around it, but refused to give the Commanders any money for a new stadium. And Virginia tabled a bill on the issue in June, putting the debate on pause until at least next year. The Carolina Panthers football team ended a project already under construction to build an $800 million training facility after the town of Rock Hill, South Carolina didn't pay over $200 million for local public infrastructure. And the Atlanta Braves, 5 years after building a stadium with $300 million in funds, are asking local officials in Cobb County, Georgia, to give them $200 million more in tax breaks to build an office building next door.